in Mullumbimby, New South Wales, in the eastern part of the continent in Australia. It is December the 11th here and I'm talking to Snake Bloomstrand all the way in Minneapolis, where it's still December 10th. And I met you, about 16 years ago when I was a participant in the New Warrior Adventure Training. And I was touched by a comment you made that I'll get into when we get there. And I've followed you from afar and then more recently closer up. And delighted that you've agreed to participate. So I'd like to get into where you were born, what the circumstances were, what your parents did, or how you were influenced, siblings, all that, who you are and why.
Well, I'm glad to be here. I grew up in Minneapolis, and my father worked in the hotel business. Later to find out that my father was a gay man, closeted all those years and came out to me in my mid-30s. But pretty standard upbringing in terms of my mother was a very aware woman and educated and very interested in personal growth types of things. She was a special ed teacher, taught autistic and Down syndrome. So we always had kids for weekends and whatnot over at our house. And I kind of grew up with that openness to alternate reality, if you'd have it that way. I was always amazed at the intelligence, the savant quality of the kids. I went to school and there's a lot of outdoors hockey and baseball and football and normal kid types of things like that.
Siblings? What kind of siblings?
I had a sister. She's 3 years younger than I am. And still very close. We weren't close as kids, but as adults, we grew close. But both my parents are dead. My father died in 1982. He was in the first wave of AIDS victims. He was sexually active during that time. The doctors were chasing around some strange blood problem that he had, and they couldn't quite diagnose it. And so we suspect that very first wave of AIDS victims, he was one of them. And my mother lived another 15, 18 years, and she lived into her mid 80s, and she's dead now too. So it's just my sister and I left.
And what was school like for you? Were you a jock, a nerd like me, or a big man on campus?
Uninterested. For me, school was something that I had to do. It didn't really inspire me in any particular way. I don't think it was until high school that I really got the bug to educate myself. I had an art teacher who somehow wrangled it so I could get 2 hours in the art studio by myself each day.
Wow.
And had an English literature teacher who really challenged me to write. And those two teachers really sparked an interest in learning. And in my late 20s, I went back to school and became a tool designer and a draftsman, and went through all the math training, calculus and whatnot. And I still see that going back to school and those courses is one of the biggest achievements that I ever made. I had never kept up with math, never understood any bit of it, started pretty much from scratch in my late 20s and succeeded and understood it. And that's like quite an achievement at the time. I worked in engineering for about 5 or 6 years, found it not as creative as I'd hoped, and did a series of different entrepreneurial types of things, buying and selling houses. I had a import business and retail business. Ended up up until 2008 in a custom window manufacturing place where my wife and I owned the business. And so manufacturing, creative art, those are always been and still are real strong interests for me. I do sculpture and a fair amount of drawing in the winter time, but the big creative outlet for me the last 10 years has been writing. Published 2 books, self-published 2 books, and find the creative hit that's so important to me comes with writing. Now that I've got it down to a point where I can actually express myself in words. I've always been a good speaker, not so much of a writer. Too many things in my head. So writing's helped me sort that out.
A little bit more back with high school, like what kind of girlfriends did you have? Other activities?
Yeah, cars, motorcycles, girls. In the wintertime, I've always really enjoyed winter. And so skiing, hockey, there's a hockey game that's been played on one of the city lakes where they clear it for the last 58 years, a pickup hockey game on Sunday morning.
Wow.
All different ages. And so as a kid and as a young adult, go down Sunday morning and play hockey for a couple hours or cross country ski. So that type of thing, and a lot of outdoors, boundary waters and canoeing and fishing in the summertime. So outdoors, the way things look for me today is come May, I step outside and I don't really go back in until October or November. And then I transition over to writing and drawing and indoor sports and don't spend as much time outdoors in the winter as I used to. Occasionally.
Yeah, I had enough cold winters in Ohio. I'm a summer freak, following the sun between North America and Australia. So
I'm starting to see the wisdom in that, actually.
well, for living in Minnesota, I mean, probably Ohio is nothing compared to my son-in-law is from Minneapolis, and I don't know, they're in California now, but so you had a motorcycle?
Yep, had several of them. I think the real love of my life, and I still dream about it, is I had a Sunbeam Tiger. It was a small British 2-seater sports car with a V8 engine in it.
Wow.
And we used to road race a lot in Wisconsin. They'd set up courses and time races and sports car club. And from about the time I was 17 to 20, racing sports cars and motorcycles was primary occupation. I also worked during that time. I started working when I was 14, but got a job in a flower shop when I was 16 as a floral designer, and worked there pretty much until I swapped over to engineering. Worked there until I was in my late 20s and loved that business. It was all decorating for big banquets and weddings and large arrangements of 8 dozen roses. And what was wonderful about it is you'd go to work and you'd stand in flowers all day and be creative.
Wow. Yeah. Now, socially, what you mentioned there were some girlfriends on the back of your motorcycle, or what?
Sometimes I think the first real serious relationship I got into was when I was 16, and it caused me to move away from home at that point in time. Not that I was angry at my folks or seduced by her necessarily, but it sparked a sense of independence that really has never left me. I moved out when I was 16 and stayed on my own through the last year of high school and onwards from there.
Mm.
So, but the girlfriends kind of came and went. I lived in a big rooming house in Minneapolis, and one of the things we did, everybody, there was about 6 men there older than I was at that point, and we would do a keg party once a month, charge $1 at the door, and quite often by 10:30 or so in the evening, we'd have $600, enough to pay all our rents. And one of us would call the police, everyone would run, and we'd end up with a keg of beer and $600 and our rent paid. That was my introduction to entrepreneurial stuff when I was 16.
Well, what kind of a place would take 600 people though? It's a
It
big
was a
place.
big old mansion, and the people did spill out into the yard and down the street. So,
Uh,
at 10:30, 11 o'clock, the neighbors had had enough, and it was time to call the police anyway.
so they got a little bit of beer for their money, but they didn't stay too late. What a great system.
It really paid off well because most of the kids were underage. And so when the police came, they'd just leave, and they'd leave all their liquor and whatever behind. And so we could usually live off that for most of the months, Joe. But it
Quite the
was,
entrepreneur.
the 67, 68, something like that. And drugs were just coming in, and there were a lot of drugs through the house, a lot of alcohol through the house, and a lot of people through the house. And at that point in time, several of the men that lived in the house were in their mid 20s, most of them, and had just come back from Vietnam.
Mm.
And so I've never really thought about it before, but I think that's where my interest came in the impact of war. I'd been active before, politically active, protesting against the draft and this and that, and ended up being a conscientious objector. But I've always had a fascination with how war, combat, the military changes individuals.
Hmm.
I saw it firsthand when I was 16, saw a lot of the post traumatic stress and distress and ungroundedness and how hard that transition was.
Now, how early did you realize you were a pacifist? Was this in your mother's influence or what? Uh,
Partially in that she really encouraged us to be socially conscious and make up our own minds to think our own thoughts around politics and ethical issues one way or another. And there was a lot of discussion about that in the house.
mm,
Um, but it really was, I was in the first draft lottery during that time, and it's the one and only time I ever won. I got number 4, which
oh,
in
wow.
1969 meant that I was going right to
Right.
Vietnam,
Yeah.
Cambodia, and I'd been active before and had looked into getting conscientious objector status, but when I got such a low draft number and it was sure that I'd be drafted, I applied and went through all the interviews and the writing and what was necessary to do that.
Uh-huh.
I did get approved for conscientious objector status, and at, at the time, one of the few that really went in naive and totally unprepared. I didn't do it on religious grounds, I did it on ethical and moral grounds. Normally, at that point in time, you really needed a priest or a minister to
Hmm.
support those viewpoints of pacifism. And I took another course in my ignorance, and the draft board did grant me conscientious objector status. And what that meant was that I needed to do 2 years of alternative service and and put in that time, but it was in a civilian capacity.
So what did you do?
Well, there wasn't a lot that was approved to do by the Selective Service at that point in time. You could go to California and work for the Conservation Corps, and they were basically rebuilding old ghost towns and then coming in and bulldozing them over after they'd been restored. It was nonsense work. Or you could work at a soup kitchen, and they had limits in terms of how much money you could make and whatnot. So I got together with local organizers, particularly the Quakers, and we took advantage of the situation by starting various businesses and then getting them approved by Selective Service. And we brought conscientious objectors from all over the country to Minneapolis to staff various different social programs like the food co-ops. We started a community garage where people could rent space and learn to work on their own cars, and several different open schools at that point in time for kids who had, been kicked out of school and told not to return with behavior problems. So we brought people from all over the country here, got those projects approved, and that became our staff. It really worked out well with the financial limitations. I think you could only make $75 a week or something like that in whatever you did. And so they made it difficult for you. It was indeed service. And it, it, it really matured me in a big way, uh, from the standpoint of to self-determination. There were other people who wanted to determine the course of their own lives as well and do it according to their own ethics and values. And I found people with similar minds during that period, uh, and actually serving in a concrete way that served the community. So it was a win-win all the way around.
It sounds like it, yeah. Now, you were doing this and working in the floral shop before, after, during? How did that work?
Before I was working at the flower shop, but when I was drafted and had to do the service, then I worked usually Saturdays and Sundays to pick up some extra money and
Mhm.
work during the week at both the free school and at the community garage and at the food co-ops. Put in, 40 hours a week doing a variety of those things. Because I was also helping to organize and fundraise and whatnot for what we needed.
And now the big transition into engineering, how did that come about?
I always had a real creative bend and real curious how things go together, and I really figured that engineering would be the way that I could make a life, have a career. The flower shop wasn't going to be financially viable working there, and so I needed to look for something else. And I was maybe 3 years married at that point in time, and we wanted to have kids, and so it was, well, here's the blueprint. You get a real job, and you go to work, and you build a career. And so engineering represented that, and I thought it would be a far more creative than it ended up to be. And it didn't scratch that itch that had been
Mhm.
satisfied at the flower shop or so many other things that I'd done where it really counted on a lot of creativity in order to get through. So I did
And you
it
had
for
to go,
years and was successful and somewhat enjoyed it, but it felt like working in a cube was not a way that
hmm,
I wanted to spend my time. At one point, I worked for a big company early on, Honeywell, and Honeywell had probably 60 draftsmen all working in one room. And I got a job working as a draftsman. and I was way in the back dark corner of the room. And one of the older guys came up to me and he said, "You see those desks up by the window? You have to wait till one of those guys die before you get a window seat. We all move up one spot when someone dies or retires." And that pretty much soured me on that job. I
Career
did find
ladder.
a creative way to apply the engineering and the tool design. I worked for another company doing government contracts where we did manufacturing and fabrication for government contracts. So it was a wide range of different products and machining and assembly. And I enjoyed that a lot more, but still not enough to stick with it.
Now, you mentioned you got married in there.
Hmm.
Where did you meet? What was that like?
Actually, when I was doing the alternative service as a conscientious objector, she was working for Vista at that point in time,
Oh,
and part of a school that I was a part of. And we got romantically tangled up at that point in time. And we're married for 16 years and then divorced, had 2 children. And it was a good relationship. We built an import business together afterwards too, where we found artists, artisans from Scandinavia and various different goods, brought them here and had a retail store and taught people to do Scandinavian needle arts and sweater knitting and things like that. But
interesting.
yeah, that relationship, I turned 40, wondered, is this all there is to life? And the rest is a familiar story to many people.
And you'd already done the sports car thing, so you couldn't.
Yeah. Yeah, that was old news. I needed to look for something. And, it happened that the men's work showed up about that time too. And
Yes. How did that
I
unfold?
was 38, 37 when I went through the weekend. It was in 1988. And it was a direct result of being unhappy and unsatisfied. And it wasn't, again, kind of like leaving my family of origin. I wasn't even angry. I was just itchy and didn't feel right doing what I was doing. And so that kind of contributed to it in a big way. Of course, I acted out like everybody does and found a couple relationships real quick that were the exact opposite and went terrible, and learned a lot from that. And then spent some time on my own a couple of years and said, I'm just need that alone time. And that was a real healthy thing to do. But the constant through that was the men's work, both leading MKP trainings and getting exposed to it. And, once again, the creative comes in because in 88, we were still trying to figure out how it all worked and tuning it. And there was a lot of room for innovation. And it really felt like everyone had a stake in each weekend.
Hmm.
So that carried me through a lot of stuff at that point.
What was your first contact with men's work? How did that
At
happen?
the Men's Center in Minneapolis, I think they just celebrated 40 years or something like that. And it's basically a drop in support group.
Hmm.
Uh, they had a general issues men's drop in support group. And a woman friend suggested that I needed men friends. I needed to not just go to women with my stuff. And she was right. Uh, I tried a couple 12-step programs, didn't really fit for me in a big way. ACA didn't really fit, but I enjoyed sitting in the circles. And so going to the men's center and sitting in the men's support groups, that was my first introduction. And uh, like so many men sitting in a circle for the first time, I was absolutely fascinated that these guys felt and thought many of the things I thought only I did.
Hmm.
So,
Well, now, what was the transition then to MKP, and how'd you get involved there?
peer pressure. Several of the men that had been sitting in those support groups at the men's center suggested it. And one of them came up to me one day and he said, "You know, you're always looking for something real intense to do. I've got something really intense for you to do." And I bit. And, went there like so many men do. And it was nothing like what I expected it to be. And I got a tremendous amount out of it.
Now, was this when they were in Milwaukee, or did you?
Yeah, that the original Hamelwood site.
Uh-huh.
So, in fact, I
Uh,
was talking to Tosi the other day, and apparently he has a spreadsheet of when everybody went through in those first 10 years or so.
oh,
And so apparently I have the distinction of being initiate number 322 or something.
well, now, did you meet David Isaacs at that point? Because he was in Milwaukee, and
Yep. And he's been up at the rendezvous with us as well. We do
what,
that once a year.
what's the rendezvous? I don't know about that.
We started that in the early 90s. Joe Lauer and Tosi and Bill Kautz and I and several other men decided, we enjoy each other's company so much on these weekends. What if we go up in the woods for a week, no initiates, and just hang out together? And so we've been doing that for 30 years. Uh,
Oh, okay. Yeah, I get the email from South every year, but the mosquitoes scare me off from that.
yeah, they don't eat much. So
So that's called a rendezvous. I didn't realize the name for it, but yeah,
yeah, yeah, and men come from all over. I mean, Michael Boyle from England has been there. A lot of different men. In fact, this year, up until the time COVID bit, I had a man from South Africa, a man from London, and men from all over the US who were coming to the rendezvous. So we really do get a good mix of men up there. It's a lot of fun. And
Mhm.
it's that one week out of the year that I turn my phone off and put it away
Mhm.
and in the woods. And so for me, it's very healing to go up there and do that.
How many men usually show up?
Usually anywhere from 20 to 30.
Uh-huh.
I'd say it averages around 20, 25, something like that.
And then after you were what 320 something initiate, how did you transition into a leadership role?
From staffing, there was a group of us in Minneapolis that uh, really got excited about staffing and developing our skills. So each time there was a weekend, we would drive to Milwaukee. It's about a 7, 8 hour drive
Mm.
and process each other all the way there and all the way back. And our dream at that point in time was to do our own weekend in Minnesota.
Mhm.
And so we actually did do that. We did the first Warrior Weekend that was outside of the Hamelwood site. And that felt risky, and that everyone was uh, pretty concerned that we wouldn't be able to replicate the energy that we did at Hamelwoods, or that it wouldn't travel well, or that we were too immature to be able to do it. And of course, now we know that you can do an MKP weekend on the head of a pin. I'm sure someone has. And the work is what's important, not the location.
Mhm.
And that really intrigued me. So I started leading weekends probably in 91 and got real interested in the startups. So worked in San Diego and LA and Houston and supported those communities and New York and kind of got to be the guy who travels and helps set up new communities.
Hmm.
And that extended to both Europe and down in South Africa. I organized the first weekend in South Africa and Australia. And it was more of my own personal work in that who the hell are you to be doing this traveling? I mean, you're a hockey player from Minnesota, really? So it really was part of my own journey to really look at, well, who are you really? And one of the big benefits that I got is as I traveled and worked with so many different cultures, particularly even before we did weekends, but that real first foot on the ground type of thing with half a dozen guys who never heard of men's work before. Um, Everywhere I went, men were asking themselves the same questions. Whether it was, men from the townships in South Africa or wealthy men from Byron Bay, everywhere I went when we got into the work, uh, men were asking very much the same questions, and the work resonated no matter where I took it.
Hmm.
And that's given me a lot of comfort in that, worldwide, men are a lot more alike than they are different, at least in terms of their emotional content.
Mhm. Well, just for viewers, I realized they may not know all the lingo we've been using, but Mankind Project is the parent organization, the New Warrior Adventure Training. It had another name originally, didn't it?
It was Wild Man Weekend until Bly got angry about that. And
Oh,
then into New Warrior Adventure and then Mankind Project. Yeah.
oh, those are the steps. Well, I'd been in some men's groups in the 80s, so. And then when we wound up in East Gippsland, which is a very conservative rural part of Victoria, I asked about a men's group. And the best I could get was, have you tried the Lions Club? And
Mm-hmm.
I actually had. It wasn't, my father was a lion. And then I was at a summit that our Alliance for Transforming the Lives of Children did. And a dear friend of mine I was rooming with, Skip Andrew, and he mentioned that he had, I think he brought it up. We were just talking in the room. And he said, I hated it. I was going to leave. And then 6 months later, I noticed my life had changed.
Mm-hmm.
And that clinched it for me. So I signed up and did the one in 2004. And you and forgotten who the other leader was. I know Billy from Australia was there as an assistant. What's Billy's last name? You know who I mean?
Hill.
Hill, yeah. But I can't remember who your other leader was. I just remember that on a break, I was sitting on one of those jungle gyms for kids. This is this camp in Santa Cruz. And I don't know if you were just talking to someone nearby, but I heard you say, I really don't like these weekends. I'd much rather be home with my family. But I want my daughters to grow up and be able to find men that have done something like this. That struck me.
Yeah.
And um, I was also interested in a regular group, and the I group, integration group is the lingo folks that meet weekly. And I'm actually part of one in Virginia, even though it's halfway around the world. I get there every year for a few weeks. Um, but how many, 60,000 have done the training now, or is it up from that?
I think it's about 70. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
70,000. Yeah.
And then I think Kyle said something like 10,000 men are in I groups.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's been enormously successful. And what attracted me was I got interested in shadow. Uh, actually, both Floor Bly did his little book on the human shadow. I remember when that
Oh,
came out.
Robert Johnson did one too.
I didn't I didn't find that one. Oh, I know what it was. Michael Ventura's Shadow Dancing in the USA,
Oh,
which
sure.
was the collection of his articles in a weekly, LA Weekly, I think. And I love that term shadow dancing. And we actually adopted that in the workshops we were doing of owning your projections. And
Mhm.
then Bly came out with his little book. And um, I had been involved with the Pathwork Center in Virginia, who addressed shadow, and MKP, the only two national organizations that address shadow. And I remember I was a member of the International Transactional Analysis Association back in the 70s training. Claude Steiner picked up on the shadow and said, I think we should build into the bylaws that the organization should self-destruct after 20 years. They go through a phase, what was there's a term for it, the guy that studied British bureaucracies, Parkinson's law, how organizations are lean and hungry and grow, and then they get fat and decline. And sure enough, I've seen that happen over and over. But MKP dealt with shadow, and to me that was the clincher. So, talk a little bit about your experience of shadow and how that got. What with Cliff? What was his name that was doing
Cliff
shadow
Berry.
work? Cliff Berry. I've heard his
Oh,
name. I've never actually met him, but
yeah, Cliff was a real creative and very innovative guy when we were digging into shadow. The early weekends were about the whole concept of shadow wasn't really even a part of it. Uh, Very early years, what we recognized is if we exhausted a man, we'd get authentic emotion.
yeah.
And so we used anger. Show us your anger, show us your rage. And if we could get a man exhausted as a result of being angry, whether it was the aerobics of it or the passion of it, we'd get authentic emotion. And then we could look at what was really going on inside the man. That
Mm.
was the basic recipe is get out there on the carpet, taunt a guy into 100% rage and see what you find. And Cliff, to his credit, saw the hazards in that in a big way and objected to the potential to shame men in the
Yeah.
process. And we started to see many men showing up who would just go to the emotion. We didn't need to provoke the emotion. They'd step out on the carpet and be in tears. You don't need to prod that, you need to follow it.
Mm-hmm.
And so that awareness began, and that's where Cliff really became innovative with his shadow work, and where uh, uh, Robert Moore's stuff on shadow started to come out, and it became another language by way of expressing it, and became a big part of the weekend. What's in shadow, and I've always been a real big proponent for the angry, petty, mean things that we claim are shadows. The self-judgment parts are easy to see. Most anyone can make a list a mile long of where they come up short. It's the golden shadows.
Yeah.
It's the compassion. It's the caring. It's the depth of feeling. It's service. Those types of things are what I find are the most beneficial to people when they start cracking into those shadows. What lies in shadow, where they abdicate, where they project and not claim their own. And so I always stress that there's a dark side there, that devil on the side of your shoulder saying, yeah, do it. It's stupid. Go for it. And the one on the other side that says, and our job as humans is to balance that out, not ban one or the other.
Mm.
So, an interesting another part of that is I've been real involved with the Folsom training, where what we did was take an adaptation of the Mankind Project trainings and bring it into Folsom Prison, and worked with, in the beginning, 20 years ago, it was men who are doing life sentences will most likely never be released from prison. And we would bring 20 men in from outside to staff and have 20 men or so that were serving time come together in one of the large chapels on the prison grounds and work for 3 days. They'd walk us in and walk us out at night, but we'd spend from 7 in the morning until 8 o'clock at night for 3 days. And basically not do the same processes, so to speak, but certainly do the shadow work. And the reason I get into that is we didn't want to create a whole philosophy of archetypes and shadow and Jungian psychology. We wanted to get right to it because we had 3 days with these guys, period, and that was it. So what we reduced it down to is, what is your medicine and what is your poison?
Mm.
And that took the place of this deep soul searching shadow work and gold shadow, light shadow, whatever labels you want to put on it. And I find that a much more accessible way to look at much the same thing at this point in time is, are you aware of your poison and your medicine? Your medicine being what you have to give to yourself and the world, your poison, how you make both of those things toxic. How aware are you of behaviors, actions, emotions that lean you one way or another? Knowing full well you have both, best know them.
Well, now, as it evolved, you were right there on the ground pretty much as it spread from Milwaukee to, was the training you did in Minneapolis one of the first satellite locations, or?
Yeah, it was the first one. Yeah. I think it was Minneapolis went first. I think Houston was second, and then San Diego, and then it just really caught fire after that.
Now, are you still involved? I don't know what your status is as a leader.
No, I'm leader emeritus, which means I can go and do weekends and not have any authority and choose whatever I want to do, which is a real sweet duty. What I enjoy about it is that no one's certification rests on my opinion. So the leader team is much more honest with me about what they're going through. I've pretty much seen what there is to be seen. So things get tricky. I can oftentimes be an asset, but I like moving between the initiates and the staff and the leader team freely to just help out where I can. So it's somewhat of an honorary role, not a real leadership role, an elder role on the weekend, and I enjoy doing that. But outside of that, I have very little to do with the project other than locally here. I support the guy groups locally and occasionally do special events. In October, I got a dozen guys together to go up to a camp, and it was just an opportunity to do shadow work for 3 days. And so I'll facilitate things like that. And I professionally now do coaching and a lot of consulting in different areas, but my input with MKP is supportive, but minimal.
Now, somewhere along here, you had a major life-threatening challenge. Time to move into that?
Sure. Yeah, I was 57, Never been sick a day in my life other than colds or flu or one thing or another. Never had a prescription. And started losing weight and uh, stomach pain, and went to the doctor, and they were treating me for something that might be an ulcer. Uh, they weren't really sure what was going on with me, and it wasn't real dramatic, just kind of annoying, and I was still functioning. And at that point in time, that was 2009, I had come back into MKP to lead weekends, and I had a weekend scheduled in New Mexico and one in San Diego. Questioned whether I should go and do that. My son and I were planning on doing a car trip out to both those weekends and staff together. And so I was looking forward to it and pushed through it. And during the course of that 6-week drive, I got sicker and sicker and sicker, and ended up in San Francisco basically just depleted, and came back to Minneapolis and got a CAT scan and found out that I had stage 4 lymphoma. And came as a shock because I'd never been ill. I had no idea how to advocate for myself as a patient, or that I even should. Had the fool notion that medicine was scientific, not artistic, and had a lot of misconceptions. And so coming into the whole treatment process and sound decision making, I not only was ignorant around it, but also because the cancer was stage 4, it needed immediate attention. The recommendation was chemo. And with lymphoma, the recovery statistics with the medicines they were using at that point, in terms of knocking the cancer out, was 70 to 80% survival rate. If you get beyond 5 years without a recurrence, you're in pretty good shape. And so the prognosis was good for doing the chemo. I did 9 or 10 rounds of chemo spaced 3 weeks apart. And it was real bad chemo. I would just be coming out of it and recovering from it, and there was another shot in the arm and another treatment. And so I had I'd been the heaviest that I'd ever been at about 200 pounds, and I'm 6'2", so I could carry 200 pounds okay. I went from 200 pounds down to 110 pounds in 6 months. And it was basically just skin and bones, and it took tendon and muscle. I mean, basically at that point in time, because I wasn't eating and the chemo was affecting me, my body was basically eating itself at that point in time and surviving off whatever I'd stored, and there was very little left. It culminated maybe midway through the chemo treatment, where the chemo had toxified my blood to a degree that I was really at risk of heart failure. And they got me in the hospital and swapped my blood over several times to clean it out and put fresh blood in. And that was a real turning point in the trajectory of feeling like, after that, I started eating, started feeling better. The cancer was not showing up on the MRIs and the CAT scans like it had prior. And so that's the short story of the whole thing. Of course, the psychological, the emotional impact of weathering a storm like that it changed me in many, many different ways. I'd retired about 5 years before I got sick, and perfect life. Money was rolling in. Could go out in my workshop and do art all day long. Beautiful home. 7 years into a wonderful marriage, second marriage, and something just wasn't right. I was so uneasy and getting itchy again that I needed to do something. And I built a fire one night, and did a little ritual around, whatever spirits are out there. I could use a little inspiration and direction. I could use some help. And it was 3 months after that I started to get the cancer. And came out of that whole ordeal never again questioning what I do, what my purpose is, what my direction is. I've been painfully clear about that ever since. And so in many ways, for me, emotionally and psychologically, going through that ordeal of stripping down to the very bones and really rattling the gate, being that close. There was at one point during all the blood transfusions and everything, I did code 3 times and leave my body and float around, and really felt like I had come about as close as you could come and still come back again. So it shifted a lot of things. And I was grateful for all the mythology, the Joseph Campbell, the Robert Bly, the men's work, for giving me a framework for weathering an ordeal. It was an initiatory process for me. And intellectually, I was able to frame it up in such a way that I couldn't wipe it away, couldn't rationalize it, but I could understand what I was going through, and that there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. And so in many ways, it benefited me in a huge way. And I'm one of the lucky ones to come out the other side relatively whole.
And with dark hair and much of it.
Yeah. I've oftentimes recommend chemo to people if they're balding or whatever. It's a terrible treatment to go through, but look what it did for me. So I was saying earlier that prior to going through all that, my hair was graying and thinning. I kept it short because there wasn't much left of it, and when it came back, magic.
So, and your beard too, did that come darker or how?
No, that's gotten grayer, but it's age appropriate. Let's put it that way.
I'd say much younger than 70-ish. Mine's been white for, I'm 78 almost, but it's been white for 20 some years.
Well, and I think part of it is just genetics too, because my sister is 2 years younger than me, and she still has hair the same color as me. So
wow,
and plenty of it too. So
wow. Yeah. So yeah, so many people have said how cancer was a transformative experience, and true for you too. Did you have any out-of-body experiences that you remember, like looking down on your body, or?
Yeah. The times that I did code, that was the experiences. I didn't really have the classic, white light at the end of the tunnel type of thing. But I distinctly remember the whistles and bells going off. I was in the hospital, and all the nurses and doctors running in to get me started again. And at that point, floating about at the ceiling, looking down at all this going on and looking down at myself. It's fascinating too, because the overwhelming feeling that I had at that moment was I'd anticipated being fearful, and instead it felt familiar. And I realize, shit, we know how to die just the same as we knew how to be born. This is familiar.
Mm-hmm.
And that stuck with me. It really has. It changed my relationship with fear in a big way too. Just
Mm-hmm.
general run of the mill fear in general is it always felt, and I've never been really fearful of death. I've been a risk taker all my life, so the potential for it has always been there. But confronting it, being that close to it surprised me that it felt as familiar as it did. Uh, Natural, organic. It's like, oh, I know how to do this, even though I'm floating on the ceiling. This is familiar.
Do you buy the past life theory? Do you think it would be memories from previous experiences? Or?
I've toyed with it. I mean, there's things I've encountered through my life that uh, I can't entirely deny it. Uh, Done a lot of work over the years with energy workers in different ways, and have done, what I consider as past life regression.
Mm-hmm.
I have it borne out in my biography and in the history of my family, and have images and various different things come up for me during those sessions that I'm able to pretty much corroborate in different ways. And that's added a context
Mm-hmm.
to how I see myself and how I see my family and how I see, where I come from. My family immigrated from a still very rural part of Norway. And when I was 17, I went back there searching for my grandfather's house without the name of a town or, a general 500-mile area where I expected to find something. Uh, and I actually went back there and found the house that my grandfather was born in, a little stone piled shack on the side of a mountain overlooking a fjord. And it's remarkably easy for me to find it by instinct.
Mm.
And so familiar once I got there. I spent a couple weeks walking the mountains, and the trails felt familiar. The vistas felt familiar to me. So I
Fascinating.
can't. I guess I'm closer to the whole notion of epigenetics than I am past life experience in terms of how I hold it. I do feel that there's bits and pieces that, to a certain degree, my psyche or my DNA carries uh, a history,
Mm-hmm.
and grateful to be aware of different parts of it, or have visual images, or have had that sense of feeling home in a country that I'd never been in before.
Mm-hmm. In this body, anyway.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, you mentioned you had a couple kids with your first marriage. I'm going to go back and
Hmm.
trace your relationship path, and they must be producing grandkids by now, or
Yeah, my son just turned 40. My daughter's 42. And I've got a 8-year-old grandson and a 3-year-old grandson.
hmm.
And that was another part is uh, in my first marriage, uh, part of the import store that we ran was it allowed us each to work 3 days a week. We shared the business.
Mm-hmm.
So we were home 4 days out of the week, each of us, in terms of, staggering the schedule. And it worked 3 days. So it was enough work life and social life that goes along with that, feeling like
Mm-hmm.
an adult, and quality time with the kids as well on those off days. And so we were really able to uh, work in that way until the kids went off to school. So it was a great way to co-parent and
Mm-hmm.
uh, and share the time and both be productive at the same time. And both the kids benefited from that in a big way. I like the metaphor of, I raised my kids to be very independent and very self-reliant. And my wife, my current wife, who has three daughters, raised her daughters to be somewhat dependent, and they're a real tight bond. They rely on each other in what I judge to be an unhealthy way, a normal way for them. And what I came to realize looking at all the kids as adults is my kids are very independent, very self reliant, and not convinced that they're loved.
Mm.
My daughters are not quite as self reliant, not as independent, and absolutely convinced that they're loved. And so, in a perfect world, children would have both that masculine and that feminine
Mm-hmm.
energy, whether it comes from the man or the woman, because that can swap around too. But both of those energies combine, I think, to really raise healthy kids. And
Mm-hmm.
so my kids benefited from two very different modalities and two parents that present with them as they're growing up. And my son is the one who has children. Uh, he's committed to it, excellent father, and doing a fine job with that. And my daughter has decided to not have children and has a career in business, very creative individual and very independent, but both happy, healthy, and productive people. So I see that as a win.
And has your son done any of the men's work?
He has. He actually uh, had no interest because it was dad's thing. And
Yeah.
my house was always full of men's groups as he was growing up and whatnot. Um, but when I started going into Folsom, I recognized that the men in Folsom were starving to mentor young men. And so I brought my son at 21 into Folsom. He'd never sat in a men's circle before, and he participated in one of the 3-day intensives and got a lot of mentoring from those guys and saw a whole nother side. He's always seen that as his initiation, and clearly it was.
Mm.
It took him another 6, 7 years before he did the Warrior Weekend, and was active in that up until the time he had children. And then that seems to put a dent in every man's lifestyle in terms of doing men's work.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it created a different bond between the two of us, and that we were able to travel to staff weekends together. And that picture that I have of who men are, what their potential is, that I so wanted him to see. He was able to see that. He's
Mm.
just not to pursue it in the way that I did. But he knows that that there are men like that out there, and that was
Mm.
what I more than anything else.
Now, your present and second wife, how did that come about?
Uh, we were thrust together. Uh, I'd pretty much gotten to a place where I was thinking it was time for another break from relationships. I'd been in, serial relationships, and I, about what I could do at that point in time was I was basically starting relationships with just women from overseas because I liked the notion of a 3-month visa. I could do 3 months, and after the 3-month visa expired and they had to go back, I would go to Europe or Africa or whatever, and they'd come back, but it wasn't a permanent relationship. And that didn't satisfy what I wanted. And I took some time off and wasn't interested and met this woman. And I just turned 50 and was looking for different things out of relationships than I'd ever before. I was looking to build a history with someone. And I realized that the serial relationships wasn't doing what I wanted it to, wasn't providing that ongoing history. And I really wanted that. And so this woman was a good fit. She grew up in Minneapolis. We share a lot of things in common, very compatible. And we've been together for 19 years and have done the whole trajectory that couples do in terms of 7 good years, 7 bad years, 7 recovery years. I mean, it's a cycle. When I got into it, I thought this is going to be just like a Norman Rockwell painting. This is great. It really didn't turn out that way, and I'm grateful. We've had some real hard struggles. She has a lot of health issues, and we've seen some real hard times, and weathered it and come out the other side still loving each other and respecting each other. So it's it feels like a lot of the illusions of relationship have been stripped away, and I'm grateful.
And she was with you during your trials then too.
Right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, how did you happen to meet? I'm curious. A little.
Through a friend. It was a coffee circle or a social circle, and she'd been divorced for about 1.5 years, and a mutual friend started pushing us into the same places. And then we started running into each other around town in different places and ended up going out to dinner one night, and she never went home again. So
wow. That's intense. Now, how old were her daughters when you hooked up?
All of the kids were from 17 or 18 to 25, and we've got 5 altogether, my 2 and her 3 daughters.
Uh-huh.
And that was another illusion that I had, was that these were all adults. What kind of issues could they have with me coming into the house and starting a whole nother mixed family? And I was proved naive there too. There were a lot of feelings and sibling rivalries that popped up, and old family patterns amongst both sides that needed to change and shift. And there was a lot of resentment around that. So we had her youngest daughter and my son living with us when we were first married. And it, a couple of years of them living with us, it was good for all of us that they got their own places and moved on. But at this point, I've got different relationships with all of the kids. Certainly, I'm my kid's father and carry a certain stigma in their minds around that. But I also am not the father to my stepdaughters, but counsel and someone they trust. And that counts for a lot for me. So, particularly with 3 women that, are strong, powerful women, to really gain their trust took some effort. And I'm honored by that.
Well, we've covered a fair bit of ground. I don't know if I've missed any significant chapters in your life that you want to fill in, or whether we should wrap up with your words of wisdom for future generations, or what else would you offer?
Yeah, no, we have covered a lot. I had no idea I was this interesting.
That's your shadow, gold shadow there.
I'll tell you, my wife keeps me humble on that, because when I make a comment like that, she rolls her eyes big time. So I don't get by with that much of city, which is fine. No, what I like to tell people is lean in, just lean in. I looked so many years for a blueprint, uh, some kind of a schematic that would guide me through my life. And it turned out I had to draw my own. And even though I'd read that, even though I'd been counseled that, I still believed that I could pick it up elsewhere and just apply it. And so, what I tell people is lean in. And I'm a fierce advocate for the the pairing of emotion and intellect. I
Mm,
think we've done the world a great disservice by overemphasizing the intellect and neglecting the emotional. They're meant to be a matched pair. Both have liabilities, and together they counteract that.
mhm.
And thing that comes up for me quite often too is it's okay to do nothing. Um, I'm at a place in my life. I'm 69. My life is set up in such a way that I have the luxury to write and to create, and I'm grateful for that. And yet, every so often, that guilt comes up that I should be achieving. I've been a high achiever all my life.
Yeah.
That I do more. That I should. And I talk to a lot of men my age too who are. Gee, I feel like I'm selling myself short. I should be doing something. And it's the shoulds that I object to. Everybody finds a different way to this. And it's only by leaning in that we find that out.
Yes, that's so real for me as having been, the eldest Capricorn son of an eldest Capricorn son who often said, well, what have you got to show for yourself today? I got to earn my keep,
Yeah.
justify my existence. And as I've leaned into just being rather than doing, being a human doing in recovery. And my friend Kent, who I also brought into MKP and who also went through lymphoma and chemo. He didn't have any hair to begin with, and it didn't grow back. But he's,
Time. That's why I don't recommend it.
yeah. But he and I deal with that too, because we both support each other in learning how to become human beings rather than doings. And it's
Hmm.
particularly impactful at this point in our lives. And we don't have to be doing stuff, but there is that urge. And I think I'm finding a good mix of it, but I still um, get my nose to the grindstone too much.
And it is a mix. I'm certainly not dormant. I do plenty of stuff. My
Mhm.
days are busy. Um, but it's the guilt. Am I doing enough?
Yeah,
That
yeah,
has stilled in me. And it still comes up. I still hear it ringing in my ears, but it doesn't impact me like it did when I was younger. And I'm grateful for that.
I always remember the phrase guilt, the gift that keeps on giving.
That's
And
the truth. Yeah.
but
Guilt and shame, great motivators for me through my life.
yeah, the distinction between guilt and shame, though, has been really useful for me. That guilt is about something you did or didn't do, and shame is more core, and it's in the limbic system before we were verbal. And
Yep.
it has a lot to do with the detachment parenting and the disconnection of how we don't treat babies like mammals. And that was my work for many years of
Hmm.
attachment that is so often damaged. So that's a tougher one to get at because you don't have words for it, and there
Yeah.
aren't any specific things that you did or didn't do, but it's an underlying sense of not being enough, and
Yeah.
it's very limbic. I think um, what's his name's work on the polyvagal theory. Think of his name in a minute. Really gets to that. So
Mhm.
Well, those are great parting words to lean into it. I like that. And it's been a delight having this time with you. And I remember our having lunch, breakfast, or whatever it was a few years ago when I got up there to the Northlands, and hope I'll get back. So,
Well, you'd be welcome. As long as you wear a mask, you'd be welcome.
well, let's hope that's ending soon. Here in Australia, no one's wearing masks.
Aren't they?
I went to a kirtan the other night that my doctor, man in his 40s, led, and we were all singing and chanting, and no problem. The science on masks is pretty shaky. It's definitely a questionable issue, but hopefully we'll be through that soon. And anyway,
Yeah.
so thank you again, Snake, and
It's been a pleasure.
I will end the recording and we can do a post here.